Hello, and welcome to the third and final installment in Pricing in a Pandemic, Options, Debate, and a Path Forward. I'm Sarah Emond. I'm ICER's Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, and it's my pleasure to be today's moderator. We have a fantastic panel assembled for our conversation today, where we're going to focus on monetary prizes, advanced market commitments, and compulsory licensing. As most of you are aware, we are in uncharted territory trying to incentivize the development and think about the pricing and access for treatments and vaccines for COVID-19. The panel that we've assembled brings tremendous experience, perspective, and innovative ideas to how we tackle that challenge. And I look forward to introducing you to each of them in just a minute. But first, I want to just remind everybody about the paper that we published, Steve Pearson and I, a little bit ago, where we wanted to tackle and think about all of the different ways you can think about incentivizing innovation in this important area and the pricing and access considerations that associate those different approaches. In our earlier webinars, we've talked about the status quo, keeping things just the way they are, how we do innovation policy now, how we do pricing, how we do access. We also explored cost recovery, and that's an approach where we're thinking about how much it actually costs to develop, manufacture, and distribute a vaccine or a treatment for COVID. And last week, we tackled value-based pricing. Should we be using cost-effectiveness analysis and other measures of incremental benefit as a way to incentivize and price therapies? Today, we're talking about three more innovative approaches, and we have experts in each of these areas: monetary prizes, compulsory licensing, and advanced market commitments. Just briefly, a monetary prize is an approach where a government or another group of funders establishes a specific prize amount to incentivize the discovery. The first private company to develop, in this case, a successful vaccine would be awarded the prize. And then subsequently, the funders, in this case the government, keep the intellectual property and contract separately with organizations to manufacture and distribute the vaccine. In compulsory licensing, in exchange for royalties paid to the innovator, the one that holds the intellectual property, the government permits others to make, use, sell, or import patented pharmaceuticals or vaccines without the patent holder's permission. This approach includes the possibility of exercising march-in rights to mandate licensing of a product directly to the federal government. And finally, advanced market commitments and relatedly subscription models. In this approach, the incentive is designed to attract the development and the investment in novel treatments and vaccines by subsidizing the research and development costs through a commitment of the funder or pool of funders. If this works, the development is successful, then you get paid for your innovation. The government has given you a contract ahead of time to say, this is what I will pay for a successful product. Subscription models are similar. The most famous example is what they've done in Louisiana for distribution of hepatitis C treatments, where you could commit to a certain total amount paid for as much product as you need, something that would be interesting to consider as we're thinking about distributing a vaccine. Well, where are we right now? Just a quick snapshot of what's happening. We have over 500 drugs in development, 230 of which are at the IND phase, and we've had 2 drugs receive emergency use authorization from the FDA in order to treat COVID-19. It's a variety: antivirals, cell and gene therapies, immunomodulators, neutralizing antibodies, and combinations of the above. What about the vaccine space? 42 vaccine candidates, 6 in phase 3, 8 in phase 2, and 28 before that. A mix of both private industry and academic institutions acting as sponsors. And the funding varies widely: private and private-public partnerships, public only, and philanthropic sources of funding for these trials. And finally, what do we know about prices so far? Remdesivir has been priced $3,000 for a 5-day course, and you can see here that some of the lead candidates for vaccines from Moderna, Pfizer, J&J, and AstraZeneca have started to signal their pricing per dose, and you already see a wide range in the proposed prices here. I offer this just for background of today's conversation. Today's conversation with our experts will really tackle each of these innovative approaches to innovating and developing successful vaccine and treatment candidates and making sure they're priced in a way that everyone can get access. Jamie Love is joining us from the Knowledge Ecology International nonprofit think tank. Peter Bach is joining us from the Center for Health Policy and Outcomes at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Carl Schmid is a leading patient advocate in the HIV and hepatitis space. Adrian Taus joins us for an international perspective, and Nikki Lurie, who has experience working at HHS on preparedness, will be offering a government and global perspective. I do want to note there is a perspective missing. We tried really hard to get a vaccine manufacturer to join us today. Obviously, they have other priorities right now, and we are all invested in those priorities being successful. And of course, they have political considerations around this really important issue of pricing. And so while they're not here today, you may occasionally see me put on my industry hat from the decade that I spent on the for-profit pharmaceutical side to make sure that we're asking the questions and potentially adding some perspective from their viewpoint as well. So at this point, I am going to stop sharing my screen so that I can introduce Jamie Love from Knowledge Ecology International, who is going to kick us off. Jamie, to you.
Yeah, let me start my timer. You wanted to remind me how much time I had, so I think
5 minutes, Jamie, thank you.
Okay, got to cover a complicated topic in 5 minutes. Normally, I mean, people would classify prizes, or sometimes referred to by different terms, such as market entry awards, cash money that's provided. Turn off my air conditioning here. Cash prizes that are provided to developers is one way to incentivize the investment necessary or perceived to be necessary for the company to enter the market, develop a product. I think what's really unique about some of the things that are unique about the COVID crisis is just the massive demand for a vaccine and the massive extent of government funding. So some of the normal rationales for even having any kind of an incentive system set up are quite different here than they would be for example, a vaccine for malaria or a cancer drug. That said, there is an interest in whether or not you can use different kinds of incentives. And here, one of the issues is whether or not you perceive something like a cash prize or money you'd give somebody that was successful in development. And most of these size things, you only give people the money if they actually succeed at some benchmark that you have. And you don't pay when they fail. So it's different than a grant, for example, where you may get paid whether you succeed or you fail. So one thing that appeals to some people is you're only really paying for success if it's designed properly. There's a million different issues to design, and I can't cover them all, but one of the issues is the prize, the cash payment, is it a substitute for a monopoly, or is it a complement or an addition to the monopoly? Obviously, there's a lot of people in the farm industry that think that prizes should come on top of the grant to the monopoly and on top of high prices. And then there's people in my community, in the public health community, that would like to see the prizes as an alternative to the monopoly and an alternative to the high prices. Whether you can make the prize an alternative or not depends really on two major considerations. What is also, the first one is, can the governments in some ways mandate that they participate in the prize mechanism, or is it a voluntary thing? Because if it's a voluntary thing, in some cases, it'll be very difficult to get the developers to opt in unless the numbers are really, really big. And that's also the second issue. The financing for an alternative to the grant to the monopoly, the numbers have to be large. I mean, whether it's, even if it's not not a mandatory incentive, to be any kind of incentive at all. For vaccines or drug development, they have to be really, really huge, bigger than any prices that have ever been done before. They're not big relative to the amount of money in the system, but they are big in terms of what is necessary to get people to move along. Now, a market entry award would be something that would be a contingent upon a person registering a product and making a product available in the field. The modern thinking on prizes of this type, of market entry awards for drugs and vaccines, is that it should be fairly easy to qualify to some degree for some amount of money out of a prize fund that is set up. And you could permit multiple winners out of the fund, and that the multiple winners would compete against each other. And the competition would be based upon the empirical evidence of how many people are benefiting and what is the nature of the benefit. One of the critical things in drug development often is to say that the money should be given out to people that improve healthcare outcomes, not people that just match healthcare outcomes. Now, in this particular case, if your initial situation is just basically no vaccines and no effective or almost no effective treatments for COVID-19 and a compressed development schedule, you probably want to rethink some of those issues, but that's sort of the overall way of thinking. And another thing I'd say is, to make something really an alternative to monopoly, you'd have to do with more than just patents. You really have to talk about, in addition to requiring one way or the other, voluntary or non-voluntary, that you open up your patent portfolio to people that participate in the prize mechanism. But you'd also have to also get to the idea that you'd have to have rights and data, access to cell lines, and you'd have to have deep technology transfer to really make it work in a way for something like this, where you have an interest in moving things really fast. And you'd also want to deal with the cross-border issue of how you finance these things. One of the issues in cross-border financing, and I think I just need another minute on this one, because I'm right at 5 minutes right now, is this concept of share and share alike. We've had discussions with some of the major funders, and one of the issues that comes up is they feel like, well, why should we open source our technology if no one else does? I mean, what's in it for us? Because we're going to have to pay if someone else has a vaccine. Why would we give them a free ride on ours? And so one of the proposals is that you make the cross-border system work like this, that the countries that would expect to participate in the open platform and the cheap vaccines would have to agree themselves to do the same kind of openness on their vaccine projects that are funded in their country as you would in your country. So that, for example, if Canada and the United States were both on the same page on this, the openness would apply to both countries. But if Germany was not, it would not apply to them. That'd be a way to give a bigger incentive for people to go down this route. I think I'm at 6 minutes right now. I'm going to have to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Before we turn to Peter, our next speaker, I wanted to encourage people to use the Q&A box to ask questions. We will have time for questions for all of the panelists at the end. And so if you want to ask a question at any time during the presentation today, just use the Q&A box. So Peter, you can unmask yourself. Thank you. What do we need to know about advanced market commitments and bidding if we're thinking about innovative solutions to this current problem?
Yeah, so thanks for having me, and Jamie for leading up to this. I want to make just a handful of points, and I want to start with the first principles discussion about pricing. And mostly I'm going to talk about things from the perspective of drug companies or innovators. So the first thing to think about is that there is a general risk-reward structure that we use to incentivize pharmaceutical development. And it involves, in the pure form, the company taking on the research risks and costs. They spend money then. If they create successful products, they get on the market in a monopoly for a set period of time that gives them a larger return relative to their research costs, which makes the risk-reward balance work. And of course, at the tail end, there's supposed to be competitive forces that drive prices down. But that general reward structure isn't the only way to do things, as Jamie just pointed out, and it has several implications. The first is, if the traditional structure is that the companies take on risk, but then they get the financial reward when they're successful. That means the government, if it funds, for example, some of the risk up front, the size of the return to the company does not need to be as high for it still to be an attractive endeavor for the company. Now, they won't say that, of course, and no one would ever sort of leave money on the table, but that's just a basic principle of the balance. So government funding for vaccine development should lead to lower vaccine prices, while also being equal. Likewise, government commitment to purchase vaccines, if they're developed, should lead to lower prices as well, because there's always risk when you enter the market that it won't be there, if you will. You don't have pricing power, you have a competitor and things like that. It's also important to think, when we think about that reward to the company, that there's the financial reward that we typically talk about, dollars paid for treatments. But there's, in this case particularly, but just in general, there's large non-monetary rewards to the companies they also care about. And in this setting particularly, the company that solves society's crisis through the creation of let's say, an effective vaccine or an effective treatment is going to get enormous reputational benefit that has direct benefit to them long term, not only in terms of reputation, in terms of career enhancement for people who work there, for job satisfaction, but also because that reputation enhancement will help them with future negotiations with policymakers around pricing and with payers. So we shouldn't just ignore that. It's a piece they care about. It's why Johnson & Johnson continues to talk about taking Tylenol off the shelves in the 1980s, because it was a reputation enhancement they think it can continue to monetize. So all of this brings us to this question, well, how big does that reward need to be under the steady state where they take on the risk? And it's why it's a hard thing to know. One thing we know for sure is it's not the value-based price for these therapies. What value tells you is the upper bound of what you should pay, because after prices above value are really just poor uses of money relative to other sorts of things you could buy. But you certainly shouldn't think about the necessary reward to a company to get it to innovate in the way you want as being the full value of the innovation to society or to the improvements of health. That's just one corner of the bound, if you will, of what you should pay no more than. And it's one of the reasons Mark Trusheim at MIT and I proposed that for vaccines, we should really have an auction or a bid process, and that the firm should reveal through such a bid process exactly how big a prize they would need, how big a payment to produce a vaccine. And once they produce it, as Jamie intimated, you could have a series of successful hurdles that they get a series of payments on, or just one when they have something approved or whatever. But either way, then they get a large cash payment, which satisfies that risk-reward balance. And after that, for example, they could produce the vaccine at cost or something like that, or license it to people who could. And what's nice about auctions is it forces the companies to reveal the price they will tolerate. And because there's an auction process, it forces prices, the total price down, while still clearing almost by definition. And this would have been a wonderful thing to do. We proposed it a long time ago with little uptake. But it's still very akin to what Jamie is mentioning in terms of advanced market commitments, but a way of finding prices that balances the risk reward. The last point I'll make, I'll also run over by less than a minute, is that it's important to realize the negative impact of having high prices for vaccines to the point where companies see the future revenue potential and start to care about it. And the reason is, we actually want these companies to do the best clinical research they can, the most rigorous clinical research they can, to figure out exactly how we should be treating patients who are infected, exactly which vaccines we should use for which populations. And once there's money involved, the incentives point in the other direction. Companies are vastly better off if they have one approval based on a sketchy piece of data to just stick with it and try and sell their product than to do another rigorous study. And I'd point to what's happened with remdesivir, where we really need a lot more data regarding how it works, let's say with dexamethasone, whether or not it has long-term mortality benefits. Gilead will not run such studies. They just won't. And the reason is because their Wall Street and their analysts have now booked future revenue from remdesivir. And so it would be a big hit to the company and the share price. and the compensation packages for the people making the decisions if they went and did a study that showed remdesivir has limited value or just works in subpopulations. Anyway, thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Peter. Carl, keep it real for us. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that patients with COVID are getting access to the treatment they need. Potential patients, right, get vaccinated so they don't become patients in a way that we can afford.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon. Thank you for including the patient perspective in today's conversation and bringing in the historical context of both HIV and hepatitis. For patients, it's all about having access to a drug or a vaccine that they can afford. HIV is probably one of the best examples of how medicine has changed the world and saved millions of people. It's also happening for those living with hepatitis C, where we now have a cure. As a person living with hepatitis B who is healthy and alive today due to the medication I take every day, I still would like to see a cure for hepatitis B. And I'm also lucky to be a cancer survivor, but I know not everyone is as fortunate as me. Now we're all facing COVID-19, and the entire world is looking for treatments and vaccines, but all of this comes at a price. When AZT became the first hopeful drug to treat AIDS, it came at a price tag that helped spark AIDS activism. It wasn't a great drug, but it was the first. This led to the company being pressured to lower its price. No matter the cost, someone still would have to pay for it. Remember, this was the time before insurance non-discrimination laws. Activism led to the federal government setting up a program to pay for drugs and healthcare for people who are uninsured. The Ryan White program and the AIDS Drug Assistance Program celebrates its 30th anniversary this month. Better drugs combined with others have been approved over the years to the point that people today can live almost normal, healthy lives. And we even have drugs to prevent HIV. Now we're looking at long-acting drugs, and we'd still like a cure or even that vaccine that we were promised early in the 80s that some companies in the NIH are working on. While we have remarkable drugs in this country, the majority of people living with HIV are in Africa and other nations that cannot afford them. Again, it was AIDS activism pressuring companies to lower their prices and have a government to pay for them. This led to the creation of PEPFAR, where the companies could maintain their brand name drugs here, but could offer them as FDA-approved generics elsewhere, along with voluntary licensing agreements. It also came with billions of dollars from the US government and countries and foundations as well. The system in place seems to be working. It has saved millions of people's lives, although we can do much better. The AIDS community continues to push companies to lower their prices. There is active litigation against some companies over patent disputes, while others seek compulsory licensing. We also continue to push the insurance companies to ensure drugs are covered at a price we can afford. So how does this all relate to COVID-19? Like HIV, it is an infectious disease with global ramifications that could be treated and perhaps prevented with drugs and vaccines. Researchers have been able to act against COVID so quickly due to all what has been learned from HIV over the years. These drugs all come with a price tag, and someone has to pay for them. Fortunately for us in the United States, Congress has already decided that public and private payers must pay for the treatments and vaccines, with the government paying a large amount, billions of dollars. But when I look at the economic toll COVID has taken already on our economy and the trillions of dollars spent so far to assist people and businesses, and I think it's important to remember that $1 trillion is 1,000 billions. It seems that these several billion dollars are well worth the value, particularly if it can rescue us from this global pandemic. We have 2 treatments, as Sarah talked about, one of which was given away for free from the manufacturer up until now. While vaccines are receiving great attention, just like the people who already are living with HIV and hepatitis, those that are currently sick with COVID need better treatments, and companies are pursuing them. And of course, we're all watching the vaccine candidates. Some companies are absorbing the billions of dollars of R&D costs, while others are receiving substantial government funding. All are reaching contracts with our government and others to supply millions and perhaps billions of doses. The entire world is scrutinizing each of these companies, whether they are making treatments or vaccines and how much they will charge. Some have indicated they will sell their vaccines at no profit. By law, they must sell them at a fair and reasonable price. We must hold the companies in our government accountable, and there must be better transparency with all the government funding involved to ensure we really are getting a fair and reasonable price. But what about the rest of the world? How will they afford the treatments and vaccines? Looking to HIV again might provide the answer. Voluntary licensing, patent pools, and hopefully countries and foundations coming together to help pay for those who cannot afford it. Thank you, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Carl. 1,000 billion has me reeling. Nikki, you can unveil yourself. Nikki, you've spent time thinking about this issue inside government. What do we need to know from the government perspective about incentivizing the innovation we want to see?
Sure. Well, I'll say now that I'm looking at this for two perspectives. One is having spent 8 years inside the federal government with a lot of involvement and responsibilities with BARDA, and then now with CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness. And so I'll say my current perspective has given me a somewhat different view on the former perspective, in that the US government is probably the only entity, and in really the unenviable or the enviable position of having the resources, and as creaky as it is at times, the levers of power and financing to control all the end-to-end systems involved in development. You know, from the early public health surveillance and epidemiology to tell you something's going on, through the basic science, through the whole development process, through scale up, through manufacturing, through procurement options, through potentially using a procurement price to set at least a ceiling price. And then to thinking about what happens post-emergency when the products are commercialized. I know Adrian's going to talk about a lot of this, so I won't say much, but it's fair to say that the rest of the world doesn't have such a system. The rest of the world is sort of much more, I guess, like a conductorless orchestra, where some parts of it work pretty well and they play in tune, and other parts are way out of tune, and still others don't play at all. And so if I think about, especially in this pandemic situation, the government's role, obviously it has played and will continue to play a huge role in the preparedness aspects of things, whether it's the science or whether it's ensuring that the manufacturing capacity, that fill finish capacity, that whatever capacity is in place before the crisis occurs. You know, when a crisis occurs, like COVID shows up, one of the really challenging things, and it's been interesting to watch this space in this pandemic, is that industry initially has no idea, as do any others of us, whether this is going to be a real big thing or not. You know, is there going to be a market for this vaccine or not? Is there going to be a need? And so what we saw here was, for a pretty long time, except for science experiments, they really sat in the sidelines. And it took the federal government, in my mind, a whole lot longer than it should have to send signals that, yes, they are interested in the development of vaccine. If I ask why that is, you know, what I hear is some of the usual refrain. Well, we don't know if there's a market, the opportunity costs are huge, but also in terms of the US government, that they feel really burned, particularly by what happened to them with the development of an Ebola vaccine and a Zika vaccine, where a number of companies really stepped up to the plate, got pretty far, took a lot of opportunity costs, and then the federal government lost interest. And so they all felt very much in both of those like they were left holding the bag with lots of losses and really uncertain markets. And so I think that's been a real struggle for them to deal with. You know, fortunately at CEPI, you know, we had involvement already with a number of developers, and we're able to say really early, like January 7th, we'd like you to start working on a COVID vaccine, we'll work out a contract with you for development over the next couple of weeks, but please get started and have been able to structure, contracts at least to get them going. And now it's gratifying to see in some sense that the US government and others are picking up a number of those candidates, et cetera. So it leaves me with a lot of questions at what incentives are needed when faced with a global pandemic, especially since it takes you a pretty long time to figure out that a pandemic is happening. And you don't want to waste time. You can't make up time by not, by having people get in late versus early. So is a prize sufficient? Probably not. Does a prize, or even now, if you look at Warp Speed as a quasi-prize, i.e. they've narrowed down a field to a very small number of candidates, does that funding really inhibit needed innovation for second and third generation vaccines that are probably going to perform much better than the first generation pandemic vaccines we have? And obviously many of those companies are looking toward now what's pretty clearly going to be a commercial market at the end of the day. Let me just say a couple quick words about pricing, because I can only speak really from my experience in government and then sort of watching what's going on now around the world. During the time I was in government, I think we worked very hard with this model that not only supports development, but makes an advanced market commitment and set early on a target price, particularly for something like H1N1 vaccine and for other vaccines that might get procured through the stockpile. That might be, cost of goods plus, or it might be something else. But a goal was really to set a benchmark price so that it would make it easier for the rest of the world to afford something. And I don't see that is necessarily the goal now. And then finally, what I would just say, looking forward at what's going on with the rest of the world, there's obviously now intense competition. There's lots of vaccine nationalism that Adrian's going to talk about. But I see, particularly with the second generation vaccines, many, many opportunities for much more competition in the market, for this opportunity to really move to something much more like value-based purchasing, looking at vaccines that are going to be better in terms of duration, in terms of efficacy, in terms of single dose, in terms of others. Whether the US government will decide that it wants to support those next generation vaccines or just rely on the market, having potentially stifled some innovation through doing what it's done so far, is an open question. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Probably a good place for me to stop.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Adrian, what are the risks here? We might have too much of an American focus, American government, American companies. Talk to us about the global perspective.
Sure. You can hear me okay?
We sure can.
Great. Okay. So first of all, I just want to say that the Office of Health Economics is not a government office. We're a private sector, not-for-profit organisation based in the UK, undertaking research and consultancy. For transparency, we do receive research funding and consulting income from the pharmaceutical industry, but the work I'm going to talk about today was done in conjunction with the Centre for Global Development, particularly Calypso Chalkidou and Rachel Silverman. It's based on earlier work that OHE and CGD did together, developing an advanced commitment for new TB drugs, and that work was funded by research grants from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I want to make the case in a global situation for an advanced market commitment for COVID-19 vaccines, which is value-based, i.e. prices paid and commitments to purchase are made on the basis of ex-ante health technology assessment, HTA, that's looking at the value of vaccine based on the target product profile that's been issued by the World Health Organization. The more of the full profile that a vaccine is able to meet, then the higher the price would be. There'd be a minimum threshold, which could be above any efficacy hurdle that was set by a licensing body such as the FDA or the EMA. And we call this a benefit-based AMC or a BBAMC. The concept of an AMC, a market commitment, was developed over 15 years ago by Michael Kramer and a group of people working and brought together for the Center, by the Center for Global Development. It was designed for both late stage products and for early stage products. It's been used once, the AMC for a pneumococcal vaccine, now at the end of its 10-year life. $1.5 billion was raised from donors, 150 million children been vaccinated, and 700,000 lives have been saved. And there's a very nice 2020 American Economic Association proceedings paper by Kramer and Snyder, which summarizes this. And that AMC had a flat rate, cost-based price premium for doses to cover manufacturing investment. We're proposing to incentivize development as well with a price that reflects value. It's important to stress in this context, there's two parts of a value-based price. One is the incremental health gain. I'm happy to come back if there are any issues around what other gains, if any, should be included, but I think you addressed that subject in your symposium last week. And secondly, the willingness or ability to pay for a unit of health gain, which is going to vary by country and by health system, which means differential pricing across countries and potentially helped by health payer within countries. I've stressed the value-based price part. The other key is that development risk should be put back with developers and not governments. And it should be a market commitment, i.e. a guarantee that vaccines will be bought if they meet the target product profile, not that any particular vaccine will be bought. Competition between vaccines is important, as Peter mentioned, around the value-based price being the ceiling. Competition between vaccines can mean lower prices. So it's a market commitment and not the sort of bilateral contingent purchase commitments that we're currently seeing at the moment. But I want to make it clear, we're proposing that it form the basis of the Gavi COVAX facility. So the vaccine procurement part, well, step back a moment. So the WHO has a vaccine pillar that's jointly organized by CEPI, as Nikki mentioned, and by Gavi. And Gavi is taking the lead on the COVAX facility, which is the purchasing part of the arrangement. The main focus is for low-income countries and low middle-income countries, an expectation that high-income countries, such as the UK, DFID and other donors, notably the Gates Foundation, will help to fund the purchase of vaccines, particularly for low-income countries. It's important to make clear that as far as we're concerned, and I think the COVAX facility as well, certainly in our BBAMC proposal, that it will have a tail price. In other words, the value-based price will only be paid on limited volume in order to give companies a return on their investment. After that, it would be supplied at a heavily discounted tail price, but the low-income countries would be supplied from day one at the tail price. So there's a two-part pricing system. But there's no reason, and this is important, why high-income countries and upper middle-income countries should not also join the COVAX facility and the purchasing arrangements that it puts in place. This could include regional purchase arrangements, such as the EU Joint Procurement Action and PAHO. It would help to bring some certainty for suppliers as to what the nature of the market is into what is currently a very chaotic situation. As Nikki mentioned, we have a lot of vaccine nationalism. It's clear that some countries would refuse to participate in that sort of global purchasing arrangement. But the more countries that did contribute to those advanced market commitments, then the clearer signals that would be to companies that were developing and seeking to supply vaccines. So in my closing remark, advanced commitment would be a price based on the value of the vaccine delivered. We expect developers to take on development risk, not governments picking winners, and it would guarantee a market, but companies would then compete for shares of that market. And for those wanting more information about the general international situation and the specific proposals that I've talked about, if you look on the Center for Global Development website under BBAMC and on the OHE website, the paper that I recently published discussing this with my colleague Isabel Firth. So I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. I'll ask all of the panelists to now turn on your cameras so we can get to the Q&A section here. I'm going to stick on this global theme to kick us off. And so the Gavi initiative was mentioned a few times today. It's pooling money for vaccine development, and then it gives countries access to a successful vaccine up to 20% of their population. There's nothing that says a higher income country can't strike its own deal with the manufacturer to get more. So someone criticized this approach. This might allow higher income countries to sort of cut the line, get more vaccine in some of the middle or lower income countries. Can any of the pricing options we've talked today about, prizes, AMCs, address this criticism? Nikki, let you go first.
So let me maybe provide a little bit of more clarity, I think, about what I see as the challenge. Obviously, many sovereign leaders feel strongly that it's their obligation to buy doses and protect their countries. The Gavi facility has in it, a component for both self-financing countries and for low and middle income countries to ultimately procure vaccine. Right now, for countries that are making these bilateral deals as such, they're making deals, but they have no idea which vaccine is going to be successful. Because right now, the failure rate for all the anticipated failure rate for all of the vaccines is still quite high. So even if you're a country that's made a couple of bilateral deals, you can reduce your risk by investing in or buying into this much broader portfolio of candidates, actually then with a guarantee that you'll get doses on a global equitable basis. And I want to clarify this business about up to 20%, on a pro rata basis, starting with first 3% to cover what we think is the general ceiling for healthcare workers around the world. And then ultimately the assessment right now is that about 20% of most countries' populations are in this vulnerable population group, recognizing that lots of countries might want much more vaccine than for 20% of their population. I think that all the countries working together with Gavi are trying to kind of co-create the situation now where they could, if this is all successful and there are vaccines to buy, they in fact could buy more than 20% or even make an advance commitment for or purchase options for or do some other thing to send a pretty clear market signal that they could get more than 20% for their populations. Some bilateral deals now are just figuring into their deal how much doses they want to contribute to the low and middle income country pool. Others are doing things differently. I think for all of this, the name of the game is speed, right?
Thank you.
And yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Nikki. I didn't mean to cut you off. I apologize.
Yeah. And so what you don't want to have is high income countries getting all their doses before low income countries. That's all I wanted to say. Yeah.
Thank you. So Carl, if I could just turn to you, and then Jamie, I'll hit you next. I'm seeing striking similarities to what played out in terms of getting access to HIV treatments globally. A reminder here of how we don't repeat history.
Right. So, you're right. And patients not only need the drugs and the vaccines here, but they need it abroad. And so start with the treatment. I know your question was initially on vaccines, but the manufacturer, has set a price here and they've set a price globally as well. And they've also come to up with, working with 9 generic, I believe, manufacturers, 127 countries willing, I guess, to do voluntary licensing, but without royalties right now during the pandemic. So, that's for the treatment. And I think you can look to HIV, and this is what I talked about earlier, and hepatitis with voluntary licensing agreements, and where the prices are different here in the United States and than the rest of the world. And also I've seen some of the vaccine companies talking about, I saw one that said they'll have a price, no profit for the whole world, one price. But I saw another vaccine company saying we'll have, one price here in the United States and in developing worlds, and then middle and lower income countries a different price. So kind of what we do with HIV and hepatitis, we can do for COVID treatments and vaccines.
Thank you, Carl. Jamie, please.
Thank you. I was just looking at the data on the incidence of like new cases and deaths around the world. And if you look at it now in August and you compare it to May, it's really quite different. Initially, you saw these very large case numbers in Europe in particular, and then later the United States. And now you really see the growth really in Latin America has really been amazing, and I mean in a bad way. And you see different parts of Asia and Africa really having an acceleration of the cases right now. So they didn't really lead with the cases other than China, but now you're beginning to see it really taking off in the developing world. As far as the HIV story is concerned, one of the things that was really critical on the HIV thing, and it's something I spent a lot of time on during the critical time of the access movement, was whether you're going to rely upon negotiated deals with big pharma companies, or you're going to have competitive supply from generic suppliers. Everything that was important in making everything succeed was really a decision by lots of people, pushed by NGOs initially, to go the route of generic manufacturers who came in at much lower prices. But also it gave the developing countries, they were not sort of begging for deals or anything like that. They're really more in a position to determine the future. What you have right now in the COVID is, I mean, we should talk a bit more about Bill Gates's role, because Bill Gates is playing an outsized role on the policy decisions. The WHO has set up earlier something called CTEP, the COVID Technology Access Pool, and that has not gone forward. I mean, it's basically been kind of stuck, and part of the reason it's been stuck is because the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates has not really favored this. The feeling was that Germany didn't favor this. The United States initially wasn't very positive about this. And the Director General, I think, has basically circled the wagons around all this work about products. And if I could make a distinction, there's going to be a fight over who gets the products. You mentioned the 20% rule and all that sort of stuff. There's going to be a lot of nationalism about who gets the product, and there'll be a lot of hoarding of the products. Germany's not going to export 99% of its vaccine if they have one, even though they're 1% of the world's population, and nobody's going to do that if they have domestic facilities. That said, hoarding the IP and the know-how, that's really inexcusable in a pandemic. And so what we've tried to get is a distinction between is the know-how, the IP, access to cell lines and that thing on the one hand is being different than the products. We concede, although we're not happy about it, inequality and all kinds of bad outcomes in terms of the short-term hoarding of supplies. But what we don't concede is that there should be any hoarding of the intellectual property, the know. And I don't think it's only, as I mentioned before, it's not just about patents. It's really about know-how and access to the cell lines. If you don't have early deep technology transfer of the vaccine things, the patents will be kind of irrelevant. It's really easy in vaccines to pass compulsory license in the patents. It's really hard to make vaccines. And so if you don't really have a commitment on technology transfer. Now, CEPI has, and some of these different initiatives have some kind of limited sharing of access to cell lines and know-how within like a club, more or less model. It isn't the sort of open platform that we would prefer. It's complicated. There's like 5 different platforms for vaccines. What we've asked the WHO do is to identify what should be the technology transfer, ask for each of the different platforms, and identify who are the potential manufacturers in these different areas. And then work with the funders. The WHO has not reached out to any funders yet formally in writing, to our knowledge, and ask them that they commit in their funding contracts to require this kind of technology transfer. And we've talked to the HHS in the United States. They can't deal with WHO because of the White House. I think, though, that what's possible, things like the Medicines Patent Pool or Gavi are still considered kind of in play, even by the Trump administration. So I think that one of the things is, how do you motivate the people that are funding the R&D to cooperate with each other? I think Nicole mentioned that there's all these different vaccine manufacturers out there. Nobody knows who's going to be first. Nobody knows who's going to succeed or who's going to be best or how many vaccines you're going to need. So it's really in everyone's interest to have an option to get know-how from everybody else, regardless of how optimistic they are about their own things. But that's not really happening right now because of a lack of leadership. So we were hoping for a cross-border agreement at a very minimum, to share know-how, access to cell lines, and IP, even if they can't do the appropriate sharing of the products right off the bat.
Thank you, Jamie. Adrian, I'm going to shift a little bit. You hinted at this. You opened the door for me in your comments. So the description of your model is really anchored on HTA, whether it's cost effectiveness or some other value assessment for sort of setting that price. You've heard Peter say that's the ceiling. I don't know. Tell us, is there adjustments that we need to think about if we're doing HTA, because we're talking about a global pandemic and we're not talking about a new drug for rheumatoid arthritis? And then Peter, I might ask you to reflect as well. Go ahead, Adrian.
Yeah, well, I think you discussed this in the last week's session. I think we need to differentiate between, and I think Bobby Dubois and Craig Garthwaite both said, identifying what the value is, and then there's a completely separate issue of how much of that is it appropriate to give to the developer. So our starting point, certainly in the work we did on TB drugs, was to start with the health gain, and I think that's an obvious starting point. I mean, the only point I would make in reference to Peter's advanced commitment, which I think it's a very nice paper. But you could well end up with prices through that bidding process that were greater than the value-based price. I mean, it seems to me, unless you're establishing a value-based price through some form of health technology assessment, you don't know what your anchor is. And then there's a separate question as to whether competition will get you below that. Can I just quickly come back though on the sort of voluntary licensing and the differential pricing and the points that Carl made, which I think make a lot of sense. And I think what we were arguing is that this should be structured into the proposal. So companies participate and they'll get a value-based price in middle income and upper middle income and higher income countries in exchange for a commitment that they will make those licensing agreements and supply at a heavy discount, or license out to other people to supply, so that low-income countries are getting access to vaccines on time and at something that's close to cost. One final very quick point, Sarah, which is one of the parallels with HIV that I hope we're not in, which Carl mentioned and made very clear, is we don't have a vaccine for HIV. It's now nearly 20 years since we had the first clinical trial results for HIV vaccine, and here we are 20 years later and we don't have a vaccine. So let's not forget that again, as Nicole said, there's no guarantees that this first round of candidates are going to be successful. We all hope they are, but there's no guarantee.
A very important point. Peter.
Yeah, so, well, actually on Adrian's last point, and then I'll answer the question, it is routinely frustrating for me, and I think for a lot of public health people, to hear the focus on vaccines being plan A as opposed to plan B. And we need a plan A with steps that we actually know how to do and we think will be effective, things like contact tracing, adequate testing, masking, the rest of it. And then sure, absolutely, let's have plan B be a highly effective vaccine that's affordable and we can scale. But that is at least probably culturally a Western over-reliance on technology over public effort that we're seeing play out in a kind of frightening way. On the other point, Adrian, I don't disagree with you. Let me try and restate what I was talking about with value-based pricing, which is I consider this sort of a question of trying to solve an equation where you limit or you optimize a couple of things. And so 100%, there should be a price above which we as society are not willing to pay, because the money put to, let's say, a vaccine that costs a ton of money transfers more wealth to the company than society collectively gets back. Now, in this pandemic, with an effective vaccine that unlocked the economies of these various countries, it's pretty hard to imagine how big a number that would have to be, but it is for sure an upper bound. And so that's all I intended to say about value pricing. It should always be looked at as we have multiple uses of money. Certainly people who advocate for high drug prices always say, well, actually we're not constrained, but in the real world, it's clear we're constrained. We have fights, at least in the US on Capitol Hill, about giving people unemployment benefits and paying for social support services. So we are at least collectively constrained in some way. And so there are also prices for drugs where the health gains delivered by them don't justify them. And that means we shouldn't be buying them because of the value. But the important thing, in my view, to keep in mind is we are trying to create an entirely artificial market for vaccines and therapies for COVID, which begins with the artifice of IP protection and monopolies. And so in solving for the price or the revenue back to the company within this artificial market, we need to develop a sense of how big that number has to be, the same way any incentive system in a normal structure would be thought about. You don't want to underpay because you don't get the action you want. You don't want to overpay because it's wasteful. And so auctions, or reverse auctions in this case, where the companies would kind of compete against each other for a limited number of slots to produce a vaccine, are ways of getting the market to tell you what their number is. And these are sophisticated firms that understand the development risks. The probability of success is not so small that you end up with crazy numbers, highly sensitive to probabilities of success. And you could, as I suggested earlier, and as Jamie mentioned as well, you could stage such a contract as well, so that you could de-risk it. But that was the only kind of thrust of it. It is important, like I said before, if the government picks up the research costs, they are taking on costs that the company would typically internalize. It is, in a sense, the companies are now playing with house money. So the return for going to the gaming table for the company does not need to be as high to incentivize them to go, to just continue to, on this analogy, they can simply get the rake from the table and still be better off. And so we have to keep that balance in mind. The companies will never raise their hand and say, oh, hey, by the way, since you paid for all this research, we really shouldn't be charging you this much money for the product you paid for.
Thank you, Peter. Jamie, you wanted to chime in on this question?
Transparency is a missing element in this crisis. You would think in a global pandemic like this, where you're trying to build trust and avoid a lot of the conspiracy theories and just misinformation that you have that's circulated in this area, that policymakers and funders would embrace more transparency. And also it would help people understand it's affecting people in so many different ways, not just, as everybody knows, not just the health thing, but if you can't put your kids in school, if your business is going down, if you're getting evicted from an apartment, there's so many different things that are going on. People, I think, have a right to know what's going on and things that are affecting everybody at such a fundamental level. So the funders' contracts are basically secret around the world right now. We're practically having to sue to get redactions out of the BARDA contracts. It's taken a long time. We're having a difficult time getting data, getting information out of CEPI or out of Gavi. Oxford, for example, came out and said we're going to open source everything. Then they switched, and then they started, when NGOs engaged them, all their initial briefings were oral, off the record, and they weren't allowed to repeat what they were told, and they weren't giving anything in writing. And we're sort of moving, we press release here and there in terms of the pricing issues, but we should have really access to all the contracts that are being written right now by all the governments, which are public institutions, and all the major charities that are working in this area. And to Peter's question, we should, on incentive, having better granular information about what's being spent on the development of products at the clinical trial level, and at the R&D thing, at the acquisition of IP, which is one of the development costs they face, the units that they're selling, all that's, everything up and down the value chain should be transparent, so you could really be smarter when it comes to figuring out how big the incentives, if you need incentives at all, would have to be. And the WHO passed a resolution just last year on transparency, and it was complete. It's been pretty much ignored by everybody in this process. Just a year later, when we have this big pandemic, so I would hope that people working in this really up the ante in terms of transparency. There's recently a story, I think yesterday, that Italy now is the first country that's going to be requiring, I don't know if it'll succeed, but they are going to try and require countries companies that are trying to get pricing of not just COVID, but for any drug or vaccine, to disclose things on the research and development costs. And that'll be helpful if they're able to pull that off. But I think that we could start at a very minimum with government-funded R&D being much more transparent, and having the NIH, for example, and BARDA publish each clinical trial that they fund, what the cost of the trial, what the enrollment is, and asking our trading partners to do the same thing.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm going to ask one more question before we head to the audience. So as a reminder, use the Q&A box to ask a question of any or all of the panelists, and we'll head there next. So this is an open one. We didn't talk a ton about compulsory licensing today. It's been discussed in the history of the HIV community. It's been used at times in lower income countries. Viable strategy or no? Carl, first.
Yeah, so first of all, in response to what Jamie said about transparency, I think that's probably one thing that we probably all panelists agree on, because I brought it up in my comments, and we just are not getting the transparency in how much, government funding and the cost. So on compulsory licensing, it's an issue that many people in the HIV community have been pushing for, and hepatitis communities. But I'm not sure, first of all, you look at the treatment, remdesivir. I am not a researcher or a scientist, but reading that it's not an easy product to make. And there's so many components, and it takes a long time, and it's just not easy. So, and the raw materials are in demand as well. There's a limited supply. And so I'm not sure, if compulsory licensing is the way to go with that. We have seen some compulsory licensing with HIV and hepatitis. And, again, it's like for hepatitis, you still need the manufacturing, the know-how to get it done. And Malaysia has been an example that it hasn't been successful, while other countries which are using voluntary licensing are treating their people with hepatitis C and curing their people, like Thailand and India and Vietnam. So, compulsory licensing sounds great, but you still have to have the manufacturing and get it done, and it's not always easy.
Thank you, Carl. Other reflections on the viability of a compulsory licensing strategy?
This is Adrian. I mean, it just seems to me that, you're not going to achieve a huge deal. You can put pressure in certain instances, but I think what we need is a global solution that's going to lead to the development of vaccines. And what I've been proposing as part of that agreement and that purchasing mechanism would lock in the fact that low-income countries would then get supplied at a heavy discount and something approaching close to cost. And I think the critical point, I think several panelists have made this point, these are not necessarily easy to manufacture. So the other thing that certainly some of the suppliers, but also CEPI and Gavi have been working on, is who else can manufacture. So if a company is willing to engage in a voluntary license, they need vaccine manufacturers around the world who can pick up those technologies and run with them. And we do have developing country vaccine manufacturers, but so the critical issue for me, I don't think compulsory licensing is going to get us very far. The critical issue is making sure we've locked in agreements and that we actually have that manufacturing capacity in place.
Right. Nikki, did you want to chime in before I go to Jamie?
Oh, I think I totally agree with Adrian on this. And in fact, I think, CEPI has been looking for and trying to lock down manufacturing partners for each of the candidates that it is supporting, and hopefully, other candidates as well, for exactly this purpose. Let's keep in mind too that a bunch of these are new technologies. They haven't been done before. It's not even clear to me that the developers can scale up when they control the facilities. So to be clear, and I guess maybe just the other point to make about the locking down prices. One of the issues with speed now, and it's different right now than it is with the HIV drugs, is because you have to do up all the scale up at risk now, Somebody's got to fund it, and the scale up has to happen before you know if the vaccines work. The whole sort of construct of this facility is to have the high income countries pay for that part of it, pay for those at-risk payments, and get massively scaled up manufacturing so that at the end of the day, for whatever works and doses come out, you do have this really differential pricing, and you do have high and low income countries getting doses at the same time, and do have low prices for low income countries. That can only happen if you really massively scale up the vaccine manufacturing, as Adrian talked about.
Jamie, a quick word before we open it up to the audience.
On mute, yeah.
Well, on compulsory license, it'll be more useful for some products than others. Certainly for something like remdesivir, which you can buy a cheap generic out of India right now below the Gilead price. You can do it right now, and countries should do it right now. For something that requires more work in terms of the scaling up the manufacturing, I think that in the area of some biologics and vaccines, it has to be combined not just with the patent issue, but you have to really get at the know-how, the access to the cell lines, and the and the rights and the data. Now, if you're treating this as a real global crisis where you're really trying to kick out all the, maximize the production as possible and share information, you would really be having more openness and more sharing of the outcomes data, the science, the rights and data. You wouldn't have people worried about litigation between vaccine manufacturers. You'd be right now identifying who the people, Adrian was talking about, who can manufacture. That's really an important issue. It's a challenge to identify really who has the capacity to manufacture, because there's different kinds of platforms for vaccines, for example. But I mean, that is just not happening right now. There's no really aggressive, CEPI has done some within a small group of people, but I think the broader issue around the world, given the obvious problems of nationalism in terms of supplies and the strategic importance of where facilities are located and things, you see in the early on in this pandemic, you saw people impounding masks and things like that. You know that where stuff is made actually is consequential.
Mm-hmm.
Having it all made in a couple places, not a good idea for a situation like this. And if one thing you could get out of here is a good technology transfer model for vaccines and a way of basically decentralizing a bit of the production and increasing the global capacity, that would actually be some silver lining to this whole crisis. But I think right now, if you look at the statements that come out, the Biden administration put out a statement on the vaccine, didn't mention the word intellectual property. The Center for American Progress put out something, didn't mention patents or intellectual property. When the presidents of Germany or France or Canada, different countries, they don't really go there. So intellectual property remains still sort of the taboo issue for people in this pandemic. And I think it's insane that if you have a crisis like this, it affects everyone as deeply, not just medically, but economically, to the point where the Financial Times says, kick everything out, do compulsory licenses, get the vaccine out there. That's the Financial Times.
Mm-hmm.
If people can't actually mobilize and attack the strong IP model in this crisis, it really says something sad about the state of the debate on this issue. This is no place for exclusive rights right now. Everything should be based upon maximizing the capacity and the speed of the rollout. And the idea that people talk about incentives is the main thing is ridiculous. The U.S. is writing checks for $1 billion or $2 every week, to whoever's got anything like a hope and a glimmer. In fact, there's competition for people to throw money in different governments if they think they've got something going. So AstraZeneca's, they take money from BARDA, they take money from the UK, they take money from anyone that'll throw it their way, and people are ready to write checks. So I think that the IP issues have been handled really badly right now.
Thank you, Jamie. Let me invite Dave Wittrup, who's ICER's Vice President of Communications and Outreach. Dave, do you have a question from the audience you'd like to pose to the panel?
Sure, it's been a great conversation so far, and you've done a good job of handling a lot of the questions as they've been coming in. But I do have several. One came in. So what happens if one or more of these vaccines that are subject to these advanced purchase commitments don't end up working well? I know the purchases are pending, FDA approval or emergency use authorization to trigger the commitment, but if the data is still weak or limited, Is the government able to, or should the government be able to claw back any of that money in some way?
Thank you, Dave. Nicole, do you want to take a first shot?
Well, I'll take a first shot at it. Is that I think, most, as I understand it, most of the agreements are structured, and certainly when I was in government, the agreements are structured, so that you've got a kind of base contract with lots of options and milestone payments, and you don't get the additional payments and the final payments, certainly not the final procurement, unless the stuff works. Can you claw money back? That's probably a more difficult thing to do unless there's real fraud or malfeasance. But the sort of trick of this, and to some extent the art of this, is to ensure that at every step of the way that you really pay for results. And I think on the global scene now, it's a little bit more difficult. And Adrian might want to comment on this too, because everybody understands that you need to build manufacturing capacity at risk even before the vaccines work. Nobody's going to buy the vaccines unless they pass a regulatory threshold and that they work. That could mean that some of those funds that you spent in doing that manufacturing at risk are lost. What I can say we're trying to do with CEPI and Gavi is to say, we'd like to have a little bit vaccine agnostic manufacturing capacity along the lines that we've just been talking about. If one candidate goes down in a manufacturing plant, we'd like to run the air traffic controller, we'd like Gavi to, and ultimately put another candidate in there that could be manufactured, that is successful and could be scaled up and manufactured. That's a pretty complicated thing to do. It's not something that has really been done at this scale before.
Thank you, Nikki. Adrian, any comments on that?
Yeah, I agree that the whole supply side is very complicated, and that there is a case for investment in manufacturing capacity at risk and potentially sharing platforms, although, as Nicole said, that's quite difficult because there are quite a lot of different techniques that are being, different platforms that are being used. I think that for me, the core is, again, Nicole stressed this, is paying for results, as in what we don't want is a situation in which governments, or indeed CEPI for that matter, end up thinking they should be pushing a vaccine simply because they've helped to develop it. Even if it has a license, it's still, this is why I keep coming back to the WHO target product profile and the need for HTA within countries. How is this vaccine going to be used? Is it actually going to deliver health gain and play a useful role within the health system? If it's not, then don't use it, irrespective of whether you've helped to fund it or not. That's irrelevant. So I think we need to move, hence our proposal for focusing on value, focusing on paying for results, and expecting the manufacturers to take on the development risks, which does require them to have IP, but it does require us, therefore, to be locking in the lower prices for low-income countries, and of course, as Nicole has said, for locking in manufacturing capacity as well.
Thank you, Adrian. Any other comments on that question before we take another question from the audience? Good. Okay, great. Dave, what do we have next?
Sure. Well, I know this is probably a question better suited for a vaccine manufacturer, but given that we don't have one, I'll toss it out as a jump ball. Peter mentioned earlier that large pharmaceutical companies like J&J have other considerations. They can play a longer game, say, with the reputational benefits of producing a non-profit vaccine or treatment for a condition like COVID-19 and still see long-term benefits for the company. What are the considerations and differences for smaller emerging biotechs? How would their business model need to address this? Should they not really be under consideration for Operation Warp Speed type contracts? I would love if anyone could respond to that.
Peter, you want to take a first crack at that? Is reputational risk enough of a motivation if you're a company that's never had a product before?
Well, first of all, I didn't say that it was adequate compensation all by itself. I was trying to explain there's a calculus involved, which involved the company's spending some of its own money as risk capital to see if they can bring a product to market, and then getting a return on the back end if they are successful by selling their product at a profit, above the cost of making it and distributing it. And the only points I was seeking to make were, first of all, if the company takes money that reduces the amount of its own risk capital it needs to spend, the reward needs to be lower to them when they're successful to keep, let's say, the risk reward ratio fixed. And the other is that although the companies will always leave this out, it is important for us to realize that part of the return to them comes not in the form of revenue from the product, but in terms of essentially reputational revenue. And it probably varies by firm. The small biotechs may actually be better off with some reputational benefits because they're looking for exits. They generally are not operating at profit anyway. Their ability to raise in the next round and the kind of the valuation they can obtain in their next round is very much dictated by their future potential, not less so than their current revenue. And so all of those things mean if you prove out some technology that you have, you probably care less about how much you can charge for it than the fact how much you can charge for your company that created it in the first place. But every company is in fact quite different. You see Merck handling, let's say, river blindness completely differently from J&J handling their AIDS portfolio or anything else like that. They're all very different in terms of how they balance how much money they can make versus the reputational harm or benefit of being generous with their IP.
Other reflections on that question?
The only point I would make very, very quickly, Sarah, is I think it may be that emerging biotechs need partners. So, I mean, it's very interesting that, and obviously it's a UK example, but the Oxford group, the Gates Foundation insisted that they find AstraZeneca as a partner in order to ensure that they could put together a clinical development program outside of the UK, but also build that manufacturing capability very quickly. So, as is often the case with new biotechs, when they have an exciting product or prospect, then they find a partner for that particular product, and that may well make sense in the COVID.
And I might just jump in here and add one other thing. I mean, that's the same thing I think that we've really tried to do with CEPI with all of the candidates is I mean, if you're really in a rush to get vaccine, you can't screw around with letting, with having a company take an extra couple of years to figure out what to do, which, right? And so partnering them with companies with the know-how to the extent you can is really important. There's also, I think, a role for governments to do that. And certainly if I think about, Merck and the whole adventure with Ebola vaccine, I mean, this was really sort of an arranged shotgun marriage, right? That we did with BARDA and the company's name I've forgotten that came from Public Health Agency of Canada. But that's also the kind of thing you do all the time. If you want to get to the end goal and you want to pay for results, there is a piece of results payment that might be about this kind of partnership.
Helpful. Dave warns me we've got 2 more questions we're going to try and get to, and I'm going to put the panel on notice that you've got a 1-minute summary coming. So start thinking about that as we go around here towards the end of our time together. Dave, would you ask one of the remaining questions, please?
Sure. And this might be for Nikki or Jamie or Carl. This week, 31 state AGs signed a letter calling on the federal government to exercise margin rights on remdesivir. Is this possible under the Bayh-Dole Act? Is it legal?
Jamie, you want to take a first shot, and then we'll go to Carl?
Yeah, I mean, I think the term margin is a narrow term legally in the United States. It just deals with subject inventions that are defined as things that the federal government has funded. And it's often the case in products that there may be some patents that qualify under that, but there may be some other patents that don't. I think in the case of remdesivir, if you wanted to do a compulsory license on remdesivir, you'd probably have to do with both IP that the government played a role in and IP the government did not play a role in. So you could only go so far with a margin rights. You could certainly use margin rights if everything had government funding. I mean, there's Senator Dole has come out. He's 97. Someone wrote something for him, claiming, you could never do it for that, but that's not really an accurate description of what the law requires. The bigger problem is, do you have rights in the Bayh-Dole-funded patents. And the solution there is that there's a general compulsory license statute in the United States, 28 USC 1498. It's the government use thing. The US government can use any patent by anyone, regardless of how it's funded, for anything it wants. They have to pay compensation to the patent owners. And so in a case where there's mixed funding by the government and by the private sector, use 1498. And the good part is you don't have to pay anything for the government funded patents normally, because there's a royalty-free right that the government has. So that's going to be fairly cheap. And you're going to have to pay something for the ones that the private sector has done. But right now, you have capacity constraints for remdesivir, and you have cheap copies of remdesivir available from Cipla, which is a good manufacturer in India. And you could save yourself some money and alleviate some of the shortages right now by just allowing the import of remdesivir. You may have to deal though also with the data issues and get the FDA to basically register the product. And if the new indication for remdesivir has a 5-year, I should say a 3-year monopoly on the test data because it's a new indication for the product. And so that could be a challenge in the United States just because our laws aren't very good at the FDA.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Carl, you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, you know, I obviously sympathize with the people that need the drug and want the drug now, and so understand that. But as we talked about earlier, you know, it's not an easy product to manufacture. Long lead times. It looks like the manufacturer is, you know, manufacturing hundreds of thousands of doses that will be ready, they say, in October. You know, yes, you know, there was a small role with the federal government of, I guess, you know, we read press reports of $70 million or something like that. But the manufacturer has invested around $1 billion, they say. So you know, I think that the product will be available soon, although I could sympathize with people wanting it, you know, quicker.
Sure. Peter, go ahead.
Let's put our efforts in getting to a better drug than remdesivir.
Or combination drugs with remdesivir, who knows?
Absolutely. Peter, yes, go ahead.
No, to be fair about remdesivir and the extent of government involvement, I think the 70 million you're talking about is the fact that the government funded the only trial that demonstrated remdesivir is better than placebo in the US, the ACTT trial. But the government also negotiated an extremely high price that hospitals now must pay to get remdesivir in exchange for being kind of first buyer. And, you know, the company has been clear they're going to charge the US hospitals about 33% more than any other country. And that commitment to a market, which I am under the strong impression that there is a backstop that the federal government will pay the company if hospitals do not buy the product. That kind of commitment has tremendous value too. And it just gets back to this earlier point. To the extent the government steps in and pays for research, or guarantees revenue once you hit the market, those are de-risking events for the company, and we should get that back in terms of price concessions, so that not to be mean or to exert some moral authority or for some higher purpose, but simply because of basic economics. If the company is going to develop the product for a certain risk-reward formula, when we de-risk them and guarantee the reward, they don't need as much money to have the go-ahead make sense. Never mind that this product already existed and this was essentially another shot on goal, which is great. Like, I'm glad it's marginally beneficial clinically, great. But, you know, we should be doing the right studies on it, not just sort of handing over the keys to the company.
Thank you. All right. It is time for your 1-minute wrap up. Rapid fire. We're going to go in reverse order. So Adrian, I'm putting you on the spot for your final comment here. What do you want the audience to leave with from our conversation today?
So I think we should pay for results. And I think the company should be taking on more of the development risk. This is a long game. We hope that these candidates will work currently, but they may not. IP is the solution, not the problem. We need incentives. And in particular, we need commitments to supply at low prices for low-income countries. And so the COVAX facility is absolutely crucial. We need it for low-income countries, but we need the self-financing countries. We need more middle-income and high-income countries to join so that we can create a global facility that offers clarity to companies and means that we'll have a market that works and that more of the world's populations will get access to vaccines as they become available.
Thank you, Adrian. Nikki.
I certainly would agree with absolutely everything that Adrian said. It's also worth reminding us that so far the United States hasn't chosen to join the COVAX facility, either in a commitment to make doses available or to buying into de-risks the US's own profile. And I'd actually like to see both of those happen. And then finally, not to be an apologist here, but I think we have to realize that, and I agree that companies should share the development costs, some of them are, but we can't do this without them. And so we have to find really good ways to, find this appropriate balance that get the desired result for the world, that are particularly mindful of the predicaments of low-income countries. And yes, that get the high income and self-financing countries to take the extra risk and to pay the freight here. We're in this for a really long game. And I'm hopeful, frankly, that this whole model with the COVAX facility and joint country procurement can start to serve as a model for the next epidemic or pandemic. What we haven't had for this one is financing that the world has agreed on up front to make this all happen. And what I would say for the next pandemic, we can't all be passing the tin cup while we're trying to manage a pandemic.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Nikki. Carl.
Well, thanks for the spirited discussion. The audience doesn't know, but there's been an active discussion within the chat room, which started amongst the panelists, that started even before we went on the air. So in the end, it's all about getting treatments and vaccines to the people at a price that we can afford. We're putting a lot of faith in the companies right now to come through with products that will work. And it seems, hopefully, that they're going to come through in record time, crossing our fingers. Using our current system, along with a lot of government funding and advanced purchases. Yes, it's going to cost us billions of dollars, but it's worth the cost. Just like we've done in the HIV community, we have to continue to hold the companies and our governments accountable to ensure that prices are fair and reasonable, and that there needs to be government funding to pay for it all, not only here in the United States, but around the world, so they can access it as well.
Thank you. Jamie. Oh, you're on mute.
You're on mute, Jamie.
Sorry. Okay. I have three points I want to make. First of all, I think it's historically been a mistake for the governments to eliminate their own capacity to manufacture vaccines as well as other things. It used to be the governments themselves had the facilities, and they used to vaccine. Before McKinsey went around and told people that it was better, they were better off just leaving everything to the private sector. There has to be, I think, some backstop capacity at the government level to step in if you can't really get what you want out of the private sector. I mean, I think you want the private sector to do most of the heavy lifting, but I don't think you want to be completely helpless if they don't do what you want. Secondly, transparency is a really underrated issue in this area. And we just think people have to put much more pressure on every actor to be more transparent. And the last thing I want to say is that we're trying to get people to distinguish between the policies that you talk about, the products and the pricing on the one hand, and the discussion about the know-how, the IP, and the rights and data on the other. We really think that there should be no hoarding of the IP, no hoarding of the know-how, no hoarding of the access to the cell lines. And that should be a separate conversation than discussions about what's happening on the products. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Peter, last word.
Yeah, no, again, thank you for having me. A lot of important comments have come up, but a couple of things. We are, as of today, in a situation where we need to develop on the for-profit sector to do things that are important for society's health. That is not immutable law of nature. We have backed ourselves into that position, and it's worth thinking about the unbelievable crisis we now have and how poorly managed it's been on essentially every front where there's an intersection between a public need and the private sector needing to satisfy that need, whether it's therapeutics, vaccines, testing, even protective equipment. So that's worth a rethink in terms of the fundamental balance. But I want to emphasize also that it is very hard to get society's priorities aligned with the private sectors. And the thing I mentioned at the top of the hour, I'll bring up again. Companies that have these products that are then able to make billions by selling them have a very strong disincentive to conducting further studies of those products. And we're going to end up with a bunch of vaccines. Hopefully, we won't have comparative data. We are going to have therapies out there more like remdesivir, where there are fundamental question marks regarding in whom it should be used and how. Even though we have a shortage of the product right now, knowing such refined information would be truly valuable, and from society's perspective, but not from the companies, where would rather there's a sort of more general pool of purchasers and uses. So that's all I have to say. Again, thank you for this very interesting hour and a half.
Wow. And I hope that the audience shares my enthusiasm for how incredible the conversation was, the insight, the things I learned. I won't take it away that I'm a little bit depressed about the challenges that still are in front of us, but hopefully we've identified some paths forward here so that we can get back to normal. And so let me just wrap up by showing everybody where they can see all of our recordings. This recording will be available within a week. The first 2 webinars are available now on our YouTube channel. And my thanks for all of you for joining us today, and of course to the panelists for this fantastic conversation. I hope everyone has a great day.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.